Hey everybody, and welcome to WrestleLine. I'm your host John Scott, joined as always by my co-host Matt Essex, and we are on part 3 of the WrestleLine of Ken Shamrock, the timeline, and we're hitting up on 1999 now, and I think we should just get straight into this, Matt. I'm going to kick things off with at this point we're in January of 1999. And January the 18th to be precise, and we're going to Raw here, let's see what we got. So this is the time, Matt, where I'm sure you can vaguely remember some of this new storyline that was coming about, and it was the introduction of Ryan Shamrock into the mix of things. And again, I have had a lot of questions on our old podcast about this, so I think we should just address the elephant in the room here. For those of you wondering, was it legit and all the rest of it? No, she was the fictional sister of Ken Shamrock. She was not the real sister of Ken Shamrock. So Ryan Shamrock has no relation to Ken Shamrock. Matt, what was your? Can you remember when she first came in with Val Venis and that whole situation, and what's some of your memories there of that storyline?
Yeah, it's definitely one of those kind of storylines that wouldn't really make the cut in today's kind of wrestling environment.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it really falls under the PG kind of label, that's for sure. Yeah, definitely something back then that got quite a big reaction, and the way that they were portraying their women in wrestling at the time, it definitely went down that route of being a little bit too kind of sexist at times there, that she needed an overprotective brother, and that he was going to protect her from this person that was going to exploit her in some way.
Sure, yeah. Well, that was the whole deal there, and we're hitting a storyline here where, of course, Val Venis. He's out there with her, and at this time on this particular Raw, in fact, which come off the 11th of the 1st, in fact, Val Venis comes out, and then Shamrock beat him up, and Billy Gunn ends up coming out as well, and there's like a whole kind of like the Intercontinental belt is kind of like he's still Intercontinental Champion at this time, but it's kind of getting left slightly to the side because of this storyline, and the whole Ryan Shamrock thing. So first of all, she's introduced with Val Venis. That's the first time we get to see her, and I suppose as fans we're supposed to expect that she's got some sort of relationship with Val Venis. I'm guessing that's what they're throwing at us here. On this one, it's worth noting around this time, Matt, that little fun fact is that WWE officials are expected to meet with both Tank Abbott and Chemo over this weekend when they are in Los Angeles about a possible Brawl for All rules match with Bart Gunn, which could take place at WrestleMania. But nothing is definite yet. Abbott expressed interest in going full-time as a pro wrestler as well. They may also look at some of the fighters in Rick Bassman and Mark Kerr and Mark Coleman at the time as well. So I'm sure if those of you who are not vaguely familiar with this sort of time, there was a whole Brawl for All concept going on. Matt, I'm sure you remember this. Of course, it didn't end up being any of those guys. In fact, WWE went out and they got Butterbean in for this, which actually turned into a bit of a disaster once it got to WrestleMania, because it didn't last very long, did it? But Tank Abbott, obviously, that would have been quite an interesting get, Matt, if WWE or WWF at the time had have poached him, considering, again, more UFC background there in him. And it almost seems like all these UFC guys were trying to get into the WWF, which, it's interesting to think about, Matt, in terms of where we're at today and how that sort of turned around, and it's more the other way round nowadays, it seems like. You know, it's not just if you're a professional. I think at one time you can only make money in professional wrestling, but now if you are, you know, a legit tough guy, you do have that avenue of just going to UFC. But back then, I think it seemed that a lot of those guys were very, very interested in coming over to, you know, quote unquote entertainment at that time. What would what would you imagine of Tank Abbott in the WWF at that time, Matt?
Yeah, I think that would have been pretty good, actually. I do remember him having a short stint in WCW for a time.
Yeah.
And
that's where he ended up.
I think he made the transition from like UFC fighter to wrestler pretty good, actually. So I think he could have pulled it off quite well.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. We're coming from the 18th for the first now. And we're going to Raw here. Billy Gunn beats Test via DQ in a match that just went over 5 minutes when Shamrock interfered, put an ankle lock on him. Better than average as both guys worked a Shamrock kind of style match. So at this point, they're kind of like they're teasing the idea with Billy Gunn and Shamrock. There's a whole kind of corporation DX feud thing kind of going on. Obviously, Test at this point is in with the corporation. I just wanted to talk about the corporation just before we get to the Royal Rumble, Matt. I mean, we spoke about this at the back end of the last one, and of course, Bossman's with them. You got Shamrocks with them. You got Test. Obviously, the Rocks there. You had Briscoe and Patterson, the kind of two stooges. Shane and Vince. I think to a lot of people, and to my mind, Matt, this was the first kind of. I mean, it is exactly what the name is, corporate group, if you will, of the owner taking sort of sole control. But this is a time where not only is it happening in WWF, but it's happening in WCW, where there are like tons of these factions coming out of like your ear holes almost. It seems like, I mean, WCW at that time, Matt, I'm sure you'll remember there were like so many factions going on. There was the Radicals. You had the hardcore guys, the Wolf Pack, the NWO. I mean, there were like so many different incarnations of the NWO and stuff like that. You know, you had the Cloud in WCW, the Horsemen, and it seemed like WWF were trying to like up the ante with themselves as well by having the corporation, having D-Generation X. I think by this time Nation and Domination was pretty much phased out, although they still were around. What do you remember it being like that so much, Matt, at the time?
Yeah, kind of do. And yeah, like you said, WCW had a huge amount. WWE were just sort of getting into that. I mean, I'm not too sure Vince McMahon was ever such a huge fan of like factions in a whole. I mean, like, as you see from the early days, not too many of them. But you know, as a kid watching this, you know, when I was about like 10 to 13 or so, and that's when it was really starting to take off with all the factions in WWE. I was really kind of enjoying it. I thought it was kind of cool because you had your little gangs and stuff, and that's the why I saw it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was enjoying it because you get to see big off like matches when it comes to tag team kind of matches, like because that was a bit of a stale area at the time. You didn't see much of that, but it actually gave a little bit of fresh life into tag team division because you could have factions face off against other factions in very different combinations.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, well, let's hit up here at the Royal Rumble now. Royal Rumble 1999. We'll get into the Rumble match itself, but before that, Ken Shamrock goes on at second. Interesting fact here, Matt. 1999 Royal Rumble sold out weeks in advance to the tune of 14,816 fans, 13,597 paying fans, which just comes in at just over 500,000, and another 137,000 of merchandise sales that night. That's the sort of money we're looking at that time, which is quite good. It's kind of a sign that WWF is kind of on its way up, shall we say. I mean, when we started Shamrock's timeline in particular, 97, you know, big difference, big jump to where we're at now. It's like everything's going in the right direction. The Attitude Era is in full swing at this point. I think it's worth putting out there. Ken Shamrock is second on the card of this Royal Rumble night, and he goes up against Billy Gunn and retains the Intercontinental Championship in a match that just goes over 14 minutes. Shamrock, Dave Meltzer reports that Shamrock controlled most of the match and worked a very physical style. It was a solid performance by both guys. There was an ankle lock tap out. However, just to refresh your memory, Billy Gunn has still never submitted in his entire career. There you go. There's a fun fact right there, Matt. I don't know how long that went on for, but yeah, apparently up to this point, Billy Gunn had never ever submitted in his entire career. So it was an interesting involvement. That match itself, Matt, I remember Shamrock as Intercontinental Champion. Obviously, if you go back a year, he was up against The Rock. Is it fair to say, Matt, that Shamrock is kind of somewhat of a halt in his career? Do you feel like at this point WWF kind of saw Shamrock was only going to be an either kind of mid-card to upper mid-card type of guy? Or do you think they were still hope there for him at some point, given where he is still on the card?
Yeah, I definitely think there was still hope at the time for him there. I just think it's kind of bad timing that the ascent of The Rock has coincided with this. The Rock's hit a rapid trajectory to the top, and it's sort of taken a toll on Shamrock that he's had to take a step back. But perhaps if The Rock hadn't come along, Shamrock would have been in that kind of spotlight. I
kind of see with you there now. Later on that night, Ken Shamrock is involved heavily in the Austin McMahon. I say Austin McMahon because it kind of was just their Rumble. I remember watching that live as well, and I actually enjoyed it, even though McMahon ended up somehow winning the Royal Rumble. It was kind of like heavily storylined, but it was. I think because it was so original back then, we hadn't really seen anything quite like that. And of course, Mr. McMahon winning was very much shocking to consider that was going to be our main event, at least one half of the main event up against The Rock. So Shamrock obviously very much involved in that storyline, which I guess to a certain extent is a good thing because Shamrock is getting himself out there. Amongst that feud, which at the time was definitely the hottest feud going between Vince McMahon and Steve Austin. You couldn't really get any better than that. So I think if you wasn't involved with DX or, the corporation and Austin, you were kind of like, you were there. It wasn't terrible in the Attitude Era, but you certainly wasn't sort of, put on a pedestal at that time. The Raw after the Royal Rumble, of course, everybody will somewhat remember where McMahon kind of drops himself in it, and he releases that spot, and then has to gets pitted in a match with Austin at the next pay-per-view. But Gerald Briscoe and Pat Patterson tried to get Ken Shamrock and Big Boss Man to drink. I don't know if you remember this episode, Matt. It's worth, I guess, a look at if fans want to go back. It was kind of one of the more better ones they done backstage. But there was a segment where Patterson and Briscoe tried to get Shamrock and Boss Man to drink salt pepper, which is what they used to give soldiers in the wars to keep them from getting too horny. Mark Henry then come on to Deborah. Hart and Jarrett won the tag team titles from Shamrock and Bossman that night because of this in a match just under 5 minutes. So that was the end of their reign at that time. Matt, I don't think we're ever going to look back at Shamrock and Bossman and go, that was a hell of a tag team. For your money, Matt, why did that combination not work? Do you think it was just a chemistry thing, a storyline thing, or these two guys in general? What was going on with these two guys?
I think there must have been so many different factors to that. They're obviously very different styles within that ring. Sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't. But the fact that the only reason they were really tagging anyway was because they had them both in the corporation, and they didn't quite know what to do with these guys. And